The air inside the Nexus Station military bar was thick with smoke from a dozen different alien species, each puffing on their preferred narcotics after another long patrol shift. Holographic displays flickered above the bar showing news feeds from across the galaxy, but most patrons ignored them, lost in their own thoughts and memories of battles fought in the cold vacuum of space. Kethmer sat in the darkest corner of the establishment, his massive frame hunched over a glass of Vorthok, fire wine that glowed with an eerie blue light. His 6 arms moved in slow, methodical patterns as he traced invisible maps on the scarred metal table, maps of star systems where he had once fought and bled. The veteran's purple skin bore the marks of countless battles, plasma burns that had healed into silver scars, missing chunks of flesh where alien claws had found their mark, and most prominently, a deep groove across his forehead where a human projectile weapon had nearly ended his life. 30 years ago, the bar's patrons gave him a wide berth. Everyone on Nexus Station knew who Kethmer was, the only surviving member of the infamous 47th Assault Legion, the Vorthok unit that had been decimated during humanity's first major military engagement with the Galactic Alliance. His 4 eyes, once bright yellow, had dulled to a sickly amber color, the result of exposure to human chemical weapons that still haunted the old soldier's dreams. Lieutenant Veltar, a young Zelthian officer fresh from the military academy on Proxima Prime, had been watching the legendary veteran for over an hour. His blue-scaled skin shimmered with nervous energy as he finally worked up the courage to approach. The academy instructors had told stories about Kethmer, but seeing him in person was different. This was a warrior who had faced the humans when the galaxy still believed them to be nothing more than curious primates who had stumbled upon faster-than-light travel. Elder Kethmer, Veltar said, his voice cracking slightly as he approached the table. The universal translator built into his collar converted his clicking speech patterns into something the Vorthok could understand. May I sit with you? The old warrior's 4 eyes slowly focused on the young officer. Kethmer's mandibles, the fearsome jaw structures that could crush steel, clicked together in what might have been amusement or annoyance. He gestured with one of his middle arms toward an empty chair, never taking his primary eyes off the Zelthian. "You're academy-trained," Kethmer observed, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within his chest. "I can tell by the way you stand. Too straight. Too confident. The instructors fill your heads with tactical manuals and battle simulations, don't they?" Veltar nodded eagerly, settling into the chair, which groaned under even his slight weight. "Yes, Elder. I've studied all the major conflicts, the Rigel campaigns, the Asteroid Belt Wars, the Titan Rebellion, but there's one conflict that's barely mentioned in our textbooks." He leaned forward, his large black eyes reflecting the dim lights of the bar. The human war. The effect on Kethmer was immediate and dramatic. The old veteran's claws extended, involuntarily scratching deep grooves into the metal table. His breathing became labored, and for a moment, Veltar thought the warrior might collapse right there in the bar.
Oh.
Several other patrons glanced over, recognizing the signs of combat stress disorder that plagued so many veterans of that particular conflict. "The human war," Kethmer repeated slowly, tasting each word like poison. "Is that what they're calling it now? How sanitized? How, clean?" Lisa took a long pull from his fire wine, the liquid glowing brighter as it passed down his throat. "Tell me, young one, what do your precious textbooks say about humanity?" Veltar straightened, reciting from memory. "Humans are a relatively new species to achieve interstellar travel. They originate from a planet called Earth in the Sol system. Average lifespan of 80 standard years, bipedal, no natural armor, or weapons. They're classified as a Type 2 civilization on the Kadasha scale, with limited energy manipulation capabilities. Most analysts consider them technologically inferior, but diplomatically useful due to their adaptability." The sound that came from Kethmer might have been laughter, but it held no humor. "Technologically inferior," he wheezed. "It's diplomatically useful. Oh, if only it were that simple." The veteran's secondary arms reached into a pocket of his military jacket, pulling out a small data pad that had seen better days. The screen flickered to life, showing star charts from 3 decades past. Before I tell you what really happened during the Outer Rim conflicts, you need to understand something about the galaxy back then, Kethmer began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. The Galactic Alliance controlled over 4,000 star systems. We had weapons that could crack planets in half, shields that could withstand supernova explosions, and fleets so vast they blotted out entire solar systems. Humanity controlled exactly 12 colonies and had a combined military force smaller than most planetary defense forces. He manipulated the datapad, showing images of sleek alien warships alongside crude human vessels. Look at this. Our dreadnoughts were 3 kilometers long, armed with antimatter cannons, and staffed by crews of 10,000. The largest human ship was barely 300 meters and carried maybe 50 people. On paper, it should have been a massacre. The High Command expected total human surrender within 72 hours. Veltar studied the images, noting the stark differences in design philosophy. The alien ships were elegant, curved, beautiful in their deadly efficiency. The human vessels looked like they had been assembled in someone's garage, all right angles, exposed components, and what appeared to be jury-rigged modifications. "What happened?" the young officer asked, though something in Kethmer's expression told him he might not want to know the answer. The old warrior's eyes grew distant, staring past Veltar into memories that had been burned into his consciousness. "We learned that there's a difference between being technologically superior and being evolved for war. Humans. They're not just another species that happened to develop space travel. They're survivors from a world that tried to kill them every single day for millions of years." Kethmer's claws began tracing patterns on the table again, and Veltar realized he was drawing a rough map of the Kepler system. "I was a company commander then, leading 200 of the finest Vorthok warriors in the galaxy. I'd powered armor that could withstand direct hits from fusion bombs. We were unstoppable." The veteran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing Veltar to lean closer. "The first human I ever saw was at the mining colony on Kepler 7. We had been bombarding the settlement for weeks, reducing most of their defensive positions to rubble. When we finally landed, I expected to find broken, terrified civilians begging for mercy." Kethmer's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of severe agitation. "Instead, I found something that still haunts my dreams." 30 years later, the silence stretched between them as Kethmer stared into his drink, the blue flames dancing within the liquid like tiny ghosts of his past. Around them, the bar continued its normal rhythm, alien traders arguing over shipping routes, mercenaries boasting about their latest contracts, and the ever-present hum of the station's life support systems. But in their small corner, time seemed frozen as the old warrior prepared to relive his worst nightmare. Kepler 7 was supposed to be a routine operation. Kethmer finally continued, his voice so quiet that Veltar had to strain to hear him over the ambient noise. The humans had established a mining colony there about 5 years earlier. Nothing special, just a few thousand colonists extracting rare metals from the asteroid belt. Our intelligence reports said they had maybe 50 security guards and some basic defensive turrets. Child's play for the 47th Assault Legion. The veteran's primary hands wrapped around his glass, while his secondary arms gestured in the air, painting invisible pictures of that fateful day. We dropped out of hyperspace expecting to see a small collection of prefabricated buildings and some mining equipment. Instead, we found something that made no sense, according to our tactical manuals. Veltar leaned forward, his training making him hungry for details. "What do you mean? What had they done?" "They had turned the entire asteroid field into a weapon," Kethmer said, his mandibles clicking in what the young officer was beginning to recognize as a nervous habit. Every floating rock had been hollowed out and filled with explosives, had strung magnetic mines between the asteroids using their mining cables. Drink and Veltar could see his hands shaking slightly. But that was just the beginning. When we finally breached their outer perimeter after 3 days of fighting, we discovered they had been preparing for war from the moment they arrived. Into a fortress, their school had firing positions built into the walls. Their cafeteria had been constructed over an ammunition depot. That's incredible tactical thinking," Veltar admitted. "But surely your superior firepower and training gave you the advantage once you reached the surface." Kethmer's laugh was bitter and hollow. That's what I thought too. We had particle beam weapons that could melt through their crude steel barriers like they were made of paper. Our armor could deflect anything they threw at us. On paper, it should have been over in ours. He gestured to the deep scar across his forehead. This little reminder came from a human weapon I had never seen before. They called it a railgun, apparently. They had stripped the magnetic accelerators from their mining equipment and turned them into kinetic weapons. The young Zelthian's eyes widened. They weaponized their industrial equipment. Everything, Kethmer confirmed. Their farming domes had been converted into sniper nests with perfect sight lines across the entire colony. Their water purification. The system had been modified to create chemical weapons. They'd even turned their children's playground equipment into improvised fortifications. But none of that prepared us for their commander. The veteran's voice grew even quieter, and several other patrons in the bar unconsciously leaned in, sensing that something important was being shared. Commander Haywan was not what any of us expected. She was small, even by human standards, probably no more than 30 of their years old. When our dropships first landed, our sensors detected her coordinating the defense from what appeared to be their communications center. Kethmer's secondary arms began moving again, sketching battle formations in the air. The first assault wave was supposed to capture that building and cut off their command structure. 40 of my best warriors, equipped with the finest armor and weapons the Vorthok military could provide. They should have overwhelmed any human resistance in minutes, but they didn't, Beltar asked, though he already knew the answer from the pain in the old warrior's eyes. They walked into a trap that defied everything we knew about human psychology, Kethmer said. Haywan had anticipated our strategy perfectly. She had evacuated the communications center but left all the equipment running, broadcasting false orders to make us think she was still there. Meanwhile, she had positioned herself and 12 human defenders in the colony's power plant, directly beneath our landing zone. The veteran's claws extended slightly, scratching the table surface. When my warriors breached the communications building, she detonated explosives that brought down half the structure. But that wasn't the trap. That was just a distraction. While we were focused on rescuing our people from the rubble, she and her team emerged from underground tunnels and attacked our dropships. Veltar could hardly believe what he was hearing. 12 humans attacked your heavily armed dropships? Nothing but modified mining tools and improvised explosives, Kethmer confirmed. They destroyed 3 of our transports before we even realized what was happening. But here's the part that still gives me nightmares during the attack. Haywan took a direct hit from one of our plasma cannons. The blast caught her in the chest and should have vaporized her instantly. The old warrior's voice began to crack. With emotion, I saw it happen with my own eyes. The plasma burst hit her squarely, burned through her protective vest, and left a wound that I could see through to the other side. Any rational being would have died immediately, or at least collapsed, from shock and blood loss, but she didn't, Veltar whispered, already knowing the answer. She looked down at the hole in her chest, grabbed a roll of medical tape from her belt, and wrapped it around her torso like she was fixing a broken piece of equipment, Kethmer said, his 4 eyes staring into the distance. Then she picked up her weapon and continued fighting. For 6 more hours. The bar around them had grown quieter, with several other patrons now openly listening to the story. Even the bartender, a grizzled hegemony veteran, had stopped serving. Drinkson was leaning across the bar to hear better. That's when I first understood that we weren't fighting normal soldiers, Kethmer continued. This human female was coordinating her people's defense while dying from a wound that would have killed any of us instantly. She was giving orders through hand signals because the plasma had damaged her throat, but she never stopped fighting, never stopped leading. Veltar shook his head in disbelief. How is that possible? No being can function with injuries like that. That's what I thought too, until I met her second in command, Kethmer said. A human male named Taman, who was maybe 25 years old, fresh-faced and eager. Our intelligence said he was just a mining engineer with no military training. When the battle started, he was operating one of their improvised railguns. From the colony's main tower, the veteran paused to collect himself, and Veltar could see that this memory was even more painful than the others. On the second day of fighting, one of our assault teams managed to breach the tower. I was leading the charge personally, determined to end this insane resistance once and for all. We blasted through their defenses and found Taman still at his post, even though half the building had been destroyed around him. Kethmer's mandibles clicked rapidly, the sound almost like chattering teeth. I hit him with my plasma rifle at close range. The blast took his right arm clean off at the shoulder. He should have gone into shock immediately. That's what any normal being would do. Instead, he looked at where his arm used to be, picked up a plasma torch that was lying nearby, and cauterized his own wound. The young officer felt his stomach turn. He what? He sealed his own wound with a mining tool without any painkillers or medical assistance, Kethmer said. Then he picked up his weapon with his left hand and kept shooting at us. For 3 more days, 3 days of fighting with one arm, coordinating mining equipment, turned into weapons, and somehow managing to keep our entire assault force pinned down. The old warrior's voice broke completely. That's when I realized we weren't fighting soldiers or even warriors. We were fighting something far more dangerous. Humans who had decided that death was preferable to surrender, and who treated their own bodies as just another piece of equipment to be used until it broke completely. The atmosphere in the bar had grown heavy with tension as more patrons gathered around Kethmer's table, drawn by the horrifying tales of human warfare. The old Vorthok veteran seemed to shrink into himself as he prepared to share what many considered the darkest chapter of the human war. His 6 arms trembled slightly as he reached for his drink, the blue fire wine no longer providing the comfort it once had. After Kepler 7, the High Command was furious, Kethmer began, his voice hollow and distant. They couldn't believe that a single mining colony had held off our best assault legion for over 2 months. The casualty reports were classified, but I can tell you that we lost more warriors at that one colony than we had in the previous 50 years of galactic expansion combined. Veltar noticed that several other veterans in the bar had gone completely silent, their drinks forgotten as they listened to Kethmer's account. These were hardened soldiers who had fought in countless campaigns across the galaxy, yet something about the mention of human warfare seemed to affect them all. The Alliance decided to make an example, Kethmer continued. They assembled the largest battle fleet in galactic history, over 300 warships, including 12 planet-killer dreadnoughts. The target was Sol Station, a human research facility in the Vega system. Intelligence reports said it was lightly defended, maybe 100 researchers and a small security team. The veteran's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. Sol Station was supposed to be studying something called quantum communications technology. Our analysts dismissed it as primitive human science, nothing that could pose a threat to our military superiority. They were so very wrong. Manipulated his datapad again, showing images of a seemingly innocuous space station orbiting a red dwarf star. The station looked like most human constructions, functional, but crude, with none of the elegant curves or advanced materials that characterized Alliance architecture. The commander of Sol Station was a human named Dongwu, Kethmer said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Our intelligence files described him as a quiet communications officer, 32 years old, with a background in theoretical physics. No military training, no combat experience. On paper, he was exactly the kind of enemy we preferred, intellectual, peaceful, reasonable. The old warrior's claws began their familiar pattern of tracing invisible maps on the table, but this time the movements were more agitated, more desperate. We approached Sol Station with overwhelming force, expecting immediate surrender. Our flagship alone carried enough firepower to reduce the entire facility to atoms. When we sent the standard surrender demand, we expected a quick response, an unconditional capitulation. Veltar leaned forward, sensing that this part of the story would be different from the physical battles at Kepler 7. What happened instead? Silence, Kethmer replied. Complete communications blackout for exactly 24 hours. Then, just as our admiral was preparing to order the station's destruction, we received a transmission unlike anything we had ever encountered. The veteran paused to take a long drink, his hands shaking more noticeably now. Several other patrons had moved closer, forming a loose circle around the table. Among them was Krextal, a hegemony intelligence officer who had served during the same period, and Zarmith, a robotic scout unit whose optical sensors glowed with interest. The transmission began with what sounded like human music. Kethmer continued. Slow, mournful, beautiful in a way that our species had never experienced. Then came voices, dozens of human voices speaking in their various languages, but the universal translators made everything clear. The old warrior's 4 eyes grew distant, as if he was seeing something that existed only in his memories. They were funeral services, complete detailed funeral ceremonies for every single member of our fleet, not just the officers or the crew. Members, they had somehow obtained personal information about every single being in our 300-ship armada. That's impossible, Veltar breathed. How could they have gathered intelligence on that scale? We never found out, Kethmer admitted. But the broadcasts were incredibly detailed. They knew our names, our families, our homeworlds, our military records. They spoke about our childhoods, our hopes, our fears. And then, the veterans. Voice cracked completely. Then they told our families exactly how we were going to die. The bar had grown completely silent now, with even the background hum of the station's system seeming muted. Krextall, the intelligence officer, nodded grimly. He had obviously heard similar accounts before. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating, Kethmer continued. Within hours of the first broadcast, we were receiving panicked communications from our home worlds. Families were demanding that their loved ones be withdrawn from the fleet. Governments were questioning the wisdom of the entire campaign, but the worst part was what it did to the soldiers themselves. The veteran's secondary arms began gesturing erratically as if he was still trying to ward off invisible attackers. Imagine hearing your own funeral service, complete with grieving family members and detailed descriptions of how your body would be recovered. Imagine listening to your mate weeping over your anticipated death, your offspring asking why Daddy had to go away forever. Now imagine that this broadcast was played continuously on every communication channel for 72 hours straight. Veltar felt his scales prickling with unease. Surely the commanders ordered a communications blackout. They tried, Kethmer said with another bitter laugh. But Dongwu had somehow infiltrated every system in our fleet. The broadcasts came through our tactical networks, our personal communicators, even our emergency channels. There was no escape from the voices of our own families mourning our deaths. The old warrior's claws extended fully now, gouging deep scratches in the metal table. By the third day, half my unit was requesting immediate psychiatric evacuation. Hardened veterans who had fought in dozens of campaigns were breaking down completely. Some were catatonic, others were talking about desertion, and a few had to be restrained to prevent them from harming themselves. Zarmoth, the robotic scout, spoke for the first time with his mechanical voice crackling through the bar speakers. Query, what was the fleet commander's response to this psychological warfare? Admiral Korthver was furious, Kethmer replied. He ordered an immediate assault on Sol Station, hoping to end the broadcasts by destroying their source. What we found there, the veteran trailed off, staring into his drink as if it might contain answers to questions he had been asking. For 30 years, the station was completely automated, he finally continued. Dongwu had programmed their entire computer system to continue broadcasting even if the facility was destroyed. But he was still there, still at his post in the communications center, even though he knew we were coming. The old warrior's voice became barely audible. When we breached the final blast door, we found him sitting calmly at his console, still sending out transmissions. He had been shot multiple times during our assault. Our scans showed at least 17 separate wounds from plasma weapons. In kinetic rounds, any rational being would have died from the first few hits. But humans aren't rational, are they? Veltar asked, though he already knew the answer. He looked up at us when we entered the room, Kethmer said, his 4 eyes now streaming with tears that glowed faintly blue in the bar's dim lighting. His chest was riddled with holes, his left leg was completely severed, and he was bleeding from wounds that should have killed him instantly. But he smiled. He actually smiled at us. The veteran's voice broke completely as he reached the climax of his tale. And then, with his dying breath, he spoke directly into his communicator. His final transmission went out to every ship in our fleet, every family on our homeworlds, every government official who had supported the war. Kethmer leaned forward, his voice now barely a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent bar. He said, "We forgive you. We know you're just following orders, just trying to protect your own people. We don't hate you for what you're doing to us. We forgive you, and we hope that someday you can forgive yourselves." The silence that followed was complete and oppressive. Several patrons had backed away from the table, unable to process what they had just heard. Others sat frozen, staring at Kethmer with expressions of horror and disbelief. "How do you fight an enemy like that?" Veltar finally managed to ask. "How do you wage war against beings who forgive you, even as they die?" Kethmer looked up at the young officer with eyes that held 30 years of guilt and trauma. "I can't," he said simply. That's when we knew the war was already over. Just didn't realize it yet. The entire bar had fallen into a deathly silence. Even the station's background hum seemed muted as Kethmer gathered himself for what everyone sensed would be the most horrifying tale yet. His 6 arms trembled uncontrollably now, and the blue fire wine in his glass had grown cold, its flames reduced to barely visible flickers. Around the table, hardened veterans from across the galaxy leaned in, their faces marked with the same haunted expression that plagued anyone who had fought against humanity. 6 months after Sol Station, the Alliance High Command made a decision that would haunt us all. Kethmer began, his voice so hollow it seemed to echo from a great distance. They decided to end the human problem once and for all. Every available ship, every warrior, every weapon in our arsenal was mobilized for one final, overwhelming assault. The old veteran's datapad flickered to life again, showing tactical displays that made Veltar's blood run cold. Thousands of ships arranged in perfect attack formations, weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets, and troop counts that numbered in the millions. Busan Colony was humanity's last major stronghold, Kethmer continued. It sat at the edge of their territory, a heavily fortified world that served as both a military base and a civilian population center. Our intelligence estimated 50,000 human defenders and maybe 100,000 civilians, against our force of 2 million Alliance warriors and a fleet that could crack the planet in half. Krekstal, the intelligence officer, spoke up from his position near the bar. "I remember those tactical briefings. Command was so confident they were already planning the victory celebrations before the first shot was fired. The siege began." "Exactly as planned," Kethmer said, his mandibles clicking in that nervous pattern that had become so familiar. "We established a complete blockade around the planet. Nothing could get in or out, no supplies, no reinforcements, no communications. With the outside galaxy, we had learned from our previous encounters with humans, so we cut off everything that might give them hope." The veterans' claws began their familiar tracing patterns on the table, but this time they moved more slowly, more deliberately, as if he was trying to map out a battle that defied all conventional military logic. "For 3 weeks, we bombarded their defensive positions from orbit. Our particle cannons reduced their outer fortifications to molten slag. Our kinetic bombardment turned their cities into rubble. By any reasonable measure, Busan Colony should have surrendered or been completely destroyed." Veltar found himself holding his breath, dreading what was coming next. But they didn't surrender. Not only did they not surrender, Kethmer said, they sent us a message. A single transmission from their commanding officer, a human female named Yuna. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20 years old. It's barely out of adolescence by human standards. But when her image appeared on our command screens, that old warrior shuddered, his 4 eyes closing as if trying to block out a memory that refused to fade. She had the eyes of someone who had seen the end of everything and chosen to face it without fear. Not the reckless bravery of youth, but the terrible calm of someone who had already accepted death and moved beyond it. Zarmith, the robotic scout, processed this information with mechanical precision. Query: what was the content of her transmission? "She thanked us," Kethmer said, his voice barely audible. "She thanked us for giving her people the opportunity to show the galaxy what humans were truly capable of. Then she made an announcement that chilled every warrior in our fleet to the bone." The veteran paused to take another drink, but his hands were shaking too badly to lift the glass properly. Veltar noticed that several other patrons had begun backing away from the table, as if the memories themselves were contagious. Yuna told us that her people had made a choice, Kethmer continued, rather than face capture or surrender. They were going to demonstrate what humans called the ultimate sacrifice. She explained that they had systematically destroyed every life support system on the planet, not to deny them to us, but to ensure that her own people would fight with what she called the clarity that comes with certain death. The young Zelthian officer felt his scales rippling with horror. She condemned her own people to death? She gave them freedom, Kethmer corrected, his voice filled with a mixture of terror and grudging respect. Freedom from fear, from hope, from any consideration except fighting with everything they had. And then, while our command staff was still trying to process what we had heard, she broadcast something that broke the spirit of our entire invasion force. The old warrior's secondary arms began gesturing frantically as if he was trying to ward off invisible attackers. Every human defender on the planet sent personal goodbye messages to their families across the galaxy. Not desperate pleas for rescue or angry condemnations of their enemies, but calm, loving farewells that somehow made their approaching death seem like a choice rather than a defeat. Krextel nodded grimly from his position at the bar. I intercepted some of those transmissions. Parents telling their children to be brave, soldiers explaining to their mates why dying here was better than living as slaves, commanders giving final orders with the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans. The psychological impact on our forces was immediate, Kethmer said. We had come to conquer a desperate enemy. But instead, we found ourselves attacking people who had already chosen death over surrender. Every tactical manual in the galaxy becomes useless when your enemy treats their own mortality as just another weapon. The veteran's voice grew stronger as he recounted the actual battle, as if the memory of combat was somehow easier to bear than the memory of human psychology. The ground assault began at dawn on the 4th week. I led my company in the first wave, determined to end this madness quickly and with minimal casualties on both sides. How did they fight? Beltar asked, though he suspected the answer would be unlike anything in the military textbooks. Like demons, Kethmer replied immediately. But not mindless demons, calculating, intelligent demons who had shed every instinct for self-preservation. I watched a human named Wu Jin carry his wounded comrade across 12 kilometers of open battlefield while under constant fire from our plasma cannons. When I ordered my warriors to concentrate fire on him, he used his own body as a shield. The old warrior's mandibles clicked rapidly as the memories flooded back. The wounded human died halfway through the journey, but Wu Jin kept carrying the body. When we finally brought him down, our medics discovered that he had been shot 37 times, but he never dropped his friend, never left him behind. Zarmith S. Optical sensors focused intently on Kethmer. Query: what tactical advantage did this behavior provide? None, Kethmer said. That's what made it so terrifying. They weren't following any logical military doctrine. They were operating according to principles that our strategists couldn't understand or predict. How do you fight an enemy whose tactics include sacrificing everything for goals that provide no measurable advantage? The veteran's voice began to crack again as he continued. But the moment that truly broke our spirit came during the final assault on their command bunker. A human female named Yunjae had been coordinating their defensive fire from a position that overlooked our main approach route. She had been holding off 3 full companies of Alliance warriors for over 6 hours. Kethmer's claws extended fully, scratching deep grooves in the table's surface. When we finally broke through her outer defenses, we expected to capture valuable intelligence about their remaining forces. Instead, as we breached the final barrier, Yunji looked directly at me and smiled. Then she detonated enough explosives to vaporize herself and 40 of my best warriors. The silence in the bar was now complete and oppressive. Even the station's air recycling systems seemed to have gone quiet, as if the entire facility was holding its breath. But the worst moment, Kethmer whispered. His 4 eyes now streaming with tears that glowed blue in the dim light, came when Commander Yuna made her final stand. We had fought through the ruins of their colony, step by bloody step, losing warriors to an enemy that treated death like a tactical option. When we finally reached their command center, She was waiting for us. The old warrior's voice became barely audible. She had been shot in both legs. Her left arm was hanging useless at her side, and she was bleeding from wounds that should have killed her hours earlier. But she stood there, perfectly calm, holding a weapon she could barely lift. Veltar found himself leaning forward despite his terror, desperate to hear the conclusion of this nightmare tale. I expected her to fight to the death, to go down in a blaze of defiant glory like so many of her people had done, Kethmer continued. Instead, she looked at our commanding general and spoke in a voice that was steady despite her injuries. She said, "We forgive you for what you feel you have to do, but we will never surrender, and we will never stop fighting for our freedom." The old veteran's voice broke completely. Then she dropped her weapon and walked toward us, unarmed and bleeding, with that same terrible calm in her eyes. She reached our general, looked him directly in the face, and repeated those words, "We forgive you, but we will never surrender." The weight of Kethmer's final words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around the table, hardened veterans from a dozen different species sat in stunned silence, their drinks forgotten as they processed the implications of what they had just heard. The old Vorthok warrior remained motionless for several long moments, his 4 eyes staring into a past that refused to release its grip on his soul. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the hollow echo of someone who had witnessed the end of everything he thought he understood about warfare. "The Battle of Busan lasted 18 hours, he said, his mandibles clicking in that nervous rhythm that had become so familiar. When the last human defender fell, our casualties were beyond anything recorded in galactic military history. Veltar noticed that the veteran's 6 arms were trembling uncontrollably now, and several other patrons had moved closer, drawn by the magnetic horror of the tale. Among them was an elderly Andromedan medic whose healing tendrils glowed faintly. With sympathetic pain, a crystalline engineer whose geometric body structure reflected the bar's lights in prismatic patterns of distress. "I lost 230 warriors from my original company," Kethmer continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the physical casualties were nothing compared to what happened to the survivors. Within hours of the battle's end, our field hospitals were overwhelmed with soldiers suffering from complete psychological breakdown." The old warrior's datapad flickered to life one final time, showing medical reports that made Veltar's scales ripple with unease. Chart after chart displayed the same devastating statistics: Alliance forces suffering from what the medical corps called human combat syndrome, a condition that had never been documented before the war. "They couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function," Kethmer said, gesturing to the medical data. Hardened veterans who had fought in hundreds of campaigns were reduced to catatonic shells. The lucky ones only suffered from recurring nightmares. The worst cases had to be permanently hospitalized because they couldn't distinguish between reality and the memories of human faces. Krextel, the intelligence officer, nodded grimly from his position at the bar. I processed the final casualty. Reports from Busan. The Alliance High Command classified them immediately, but the numbers were staggering. For every human killed, we lost an average of 15 Alliance soldiers to death or permanent psychological disability. But we won. Kethmer said, his voice taking on a bitter, mocking tone. Technically, we achieved our military objectives. The human colony was destroyed, their defensive positions were eliminated, and their command structure was completely shattered. By every measure used in our tactical manuals, Busan was a decisive Alliance victory. The veterans' clause began there. Familiar tracing patterns on the table, but this time the movements were slower, more deliberate, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that had no answer. General Vorthak, our supreme commander, stood in the ruins of their final bunker and declared the human threat eliminated. He transmitted victory messages to every Alliance world, promising that the galaxy was now safe from human aggression. Zarmoth, the robotic scout, processed this information with mechanical precision. Query: what was the Alliance High Command's assessment of future human military capabilities? That's when the real horror began, Kethmer replied, his 4 eyes growing distant. Our intelligence analysis of the battle revealed something that chilled every military strategist in the Alliance. The humans at Busan had been fighting with less than 10% of their total military capabilities. The silence that followed was so complete that Veltar could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Around the table, veteran warriors, who had faced death across countless battlefields, sat frozen with expressions of pure terror. The weapons they used against us were improvised from mining equipment, Kethmer continued. Their defensive positions were hastily constructed civilian shelters. Their ammunition was manufactured in converted factories using industrial chemicals. Everything they threw at us was cobbled together from whatever materials they could find. Old Warrior's mandibles clicked rapidly as he reached the climax of his revelation. But the truly terrifying discovery came when we analyzed their communications during the battle. They weren't fighting desperately because they were losing. They were fighting desperately because they were testing themselves, pushing their own limits to see how much punishment they could endure. Veltar felt his stomach turn. You mean they could have fought harder? Much harder, Kethmer confirmed. The tactical analysis suggested that if they had deployed their full military capabilities, the battle would have ended very differently. We won because they let us win, because they were more interested in learning about their own capacity for warfare than in achieving victory. The veteran stood slowly, his scarred body moving with the careful deliberation of someone who carried invisible wounds. 3 days after Busan, emergency sessions were called in every major government. Across the Alliance, intelligence reports were flooding in from human colonies throughout the galaxy, all showing the same terrifying pattern. Kethmer's voice grew stronger as he recounted the political aftermath, as if discussing strategy was somehow easier than remembering the faces of the dead. Humanity had been using the entire war as a training exercise. Every battle, every engagement, every tactical scenario had been carefully analyzed and incorporated into their military doctrine. They had been learning from us while we were trying to destroy them. The Andromedan medic spoke for the first time, her voice carrying harmonics of distress that were painful to hear. The medical reports from that period are still classified. But I treated some of the Alliance survivors. The psychological trauma was unlike anything in our medical literature. They weren't just haunted by what they had seen, they were terrified by the implications of what they had learned. That's when the Galactic Council was convened for an emergency session, Kethmer continued. Representatives from every major species attended, including several who had never spoken to each other before. The topic of discussion was simple. What do we do about humanity? The old warrior's claws extended fully as he recalled the political maneuvering that followed. Debate lasted less than 6 hours. Not because there was disagreement about the threat, but because everyone reached the same conclusion simultaneously. Humanity had demonstrated that they could turn any conflict into a learning experience that made them more dangerous. Velta found himself asking the question that everyone in the bar was thinking, so the council decided to continue the war. The opposite, Kethmer said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and ongoing terror. Yes. They voted unanimously to end the war immediately and offer humanity full membership in the Galactic Alliance. Not as conquered subjects, but as equals, with full diplomatic status and military cooperation agreements. The young officer's mind reeled at the implications. You mean humanity won the war by losing every battle? They won something far more valuable than military victory, Kethmer replied. They won our respect, our fear, and most importantly, our understanding that they were not a species to be conquered or controlled. They were a species to be befriended, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The veteran turned to face the entire bar, his 4 eyes reflecting the pain and wisdom of 3 decades of guilt. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Vega Prime, signed by representatives of every major galactic power. The terms were simple. Humanity would be granted full autonomy over their territory, complete access to galactic trade routes, and defensive alliance agreements with every signatory species. Krextel raised his glass in what might have been a toast or a salute. And in return, humanity agreed to share their military innovations with the Alliance and serve as peacekeepers for interspecies conflicts. Which brings us to today, Kethmer said, gesturing toward the large viewing portal that showed the busy traffic patterns around Nexus Station. Those ships out there, the ones keeping the peace between species that have been enemies for centuries, are crewed by humans. The same humans we once thought were primitive and weak. The old warrior placed a heavy claw on Veltar's shoulder, his touch gentle despite the obvious strength in his 6 arms. That's why I'm telling you this story, young one. It's not to terrify you or to glorify war, but to help you understand something that every military officer in the galaxy needs to know. His voice dropped too barely above a whisper, but somehow carried to every corner of the no-silent bar. Humans are the kindest, most compassionate species in the galaxy. They will share their food with strangers, risk their lives to save enemies, and forgive injuries that would drive other species to blood feuds lasting centuries. But if you threaten their families, their homes, or their freedom— Kethmer's mandibles clicked one final time, the sound echoing through the bar like a death knell— then you will face something that turns death into a weapon, suffering into strength, and mercy into the most terrifying force in the universe. The old veteran turned and walked slowly toward the bar's exit, his scarred form disappearing into the shadows of the station's corridors. Behind him, the assembled patrons sat in stunned silence, each processing the implications of what they had heard in their own way. Veltar remained at the table for several more minutes, staring into his untouched drink as his mind struggled to comprehend the true nature of the species that now served as the galaxy's protectors. Finally, he became aware of someone approaching the bartender, an elderly Krillian whose compound eyes held the same haunted expression that marked all veterans of the human war. "First time hearing the real story, son?" the bartender asked, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Veltar nodded mutely, unable to trust his voice. "Then you understand now why we call them the gentle monsters," the bartender continued, cleaning glasses with movements that spoke of decades of repetition. "They're the most peaceful species in the galaxy, right up until you give them no choice but to fight. Then they become something that makes the rest of us grateful we're on their side." Outside the bar's viewing portal, the lights of human patrol ships moved in perfect formation through the star-filled darkness, their presence a constant reminder that the galaxy's peace was maintained by the very species that had once been dismissed as primitive and weak. And somewhere in the depths of space, on worlds that bore names like Earth and New Sol and Buzan Memorial, humans continued their quiet work of turning the universe into a place where war was remembered only in the stories, as told by scarred veterans. In dimly lit bars, the young Zelthian officer finally stood and walked toward the exit, his mind forever changed by the knowledge that humanity's greatest weapon had never been their technology or their tactics. Some things were worth dying for, and their terrifying willingness to prove it. The end.